He bought a scrap Starship no one wanted. It was the first human Dreadnought ever built. The auctioneer's gavel came down before I was ready. Not on my lot, on the one before it. A broken mining barge that 3 Valorian recyclers had been circling for an hour, like they could smell the iron in it, which they probably could. The gavel came down and the barge was gone, and the crowd shuffled, and I stood in the back of the room with my arms crossed, and my bid card in my jacket pocket, and 42 credits to my name. 42 credits. The price of a bad meal on Keth Station. I was the only human in the room. I had been aware of this since the moment I walked in, because the Valorian broker behind the registration desk had looked at me the way you look at something that wandered in through a door that should have been locked. He held that look for a long time, long enough to make a point, long enough for me to understand that whatever courtesy he extended to the other species in that room, I was operating under a different set of rules. I looked back at him until he looked away. That was the only victory I had going into the auction. The catalog had been thin on details for most of the lots. Mining equipment, decommissioned haulers. One entry listed only as former biological transport, do not open lower holds, which told you everything you needed to know about whoever had owned it last. Standard salvage market inventory. The kind of stuff that gets picked apart for components and melted down and turned into something more useful than whatever it used to be. Lot 7441 was 11 words. Terran pre-collapse military vessel. Unknown class. Structurally compromised. Hull integrity unknown. No image. No dimensions. No registry details beyond those 11 words. Every species in the room skimmed past it without stopping. The Valorian recyclers were already calculating the metals in the next lot. The Keth broker running the floor had not even bothered to write an opening bid suggestion. Whatever this thing was, nobody expected a fight over it. I read those 11 words 4 times. Terran. That meant human. That meant pre-collapse, which meant more than 200 years old, which meant built during a period of human history that most of the galaxy had decided was better forgotten. Unknown class was interesting, not decommissioned, not retired, unknown, as if whoever cataloged it had no framework for what they were looking at. Hull integrity unknown, not compromised, not failed, unknown, as if the sensors had bounced off it and come back with nothing useful. My chest did something I had not felt in 3 years, a tightening that was not quite anxiety and not quite excitement, something between the two. The feeling of a door that might be locked, or might swing open, and you will not know until your hand is on the handle. The gavel came down on the lot before mine. I put my hand on the handle. The auctioneer was a tall, thin Keth, with 4 eyes, and the bored efficiency of someone who had been selling other people's junk for 30 years. He read lot 7441 from his screen, without inflection, without interest, without even looking up. Terran military vessel. Pre-collapse, condition unknown, no minimum bid, who starts? Nobody started. The room waited the customary 10 seconds, and the auctioneer began the closing sequence, which on Keth Station meant a slow 3 count, and then the item was returned to the recycling queue to be broken down without ceremony. He reached 2. Salvage contract, I said. 3 years. Exclusive. Whatever I pull out of Sector 9 null. Keth Syndicate gets first right of purchase at market rate. The auctioneer looked up. The Valorian recyclers looked at me. The entire room looked at me the way you look at someone who has just done something you cannot decide is brave or spectacularly uninformed. A 3-year salvage contract in Sector 9 null was worth considerably more than 42 credits. It was worth considerably more than whatever scrap value a 200-year-old human wreck could provide. Anyone in that room could calculate that. The math was embarrassing. The auctioneer looked at his superior, who was standing off to the side near the exit. His superior made a small gesture that meant something like, "Let the human humiliate himself if it makes him happy." "Accepted," the auctioneer said. The gavel came down. I owned a spaceship. Corridor 9 null was where Keth Station sent things to wait for the end. It was not on any of the official maps. You found it by following the smell of old metal and recycler coolant, past the functional docking bays, past the maintenance corridors, past the last set of working lights, until you reached the section where the gravity was maintained at 50%, because nobody was paying the energy bill for full pull. The air recyclers ran at minimum. Everything was gray. My ship was at the far end of the corridor. I almost missed her. She was sitting in a berth built for something much smaller, and the reason I almost missed her was that she did not look like a ship. She looked like a section of the wall had decided to be three-dimensional. The hull was covered in something so thick, so old, so completely absorbing of every wavelength my suit sensors put out, that she registered as nothing, not damaged hull, not dead metal, nothing. A shape in the dark that ate light and gave nothing back. She was enormous. The listing had not mentioned size, unknown class, structurally compromised, hull integrity unknown. None of those words had prepared me for the fact that she ran from one end of the berth to the other, and then some, her nose pressing into the far wall at an angle that suggested whoever parked her 200 years ago had done it in a hurry. I walked the length of her. It took 4 minutes at a steady pace. At some point I stopped counting the gun ports because the number was making me feel strange. I pressed my palm flat against the hull near what I estimated was her midpoint. The coating was rough under my glove. It felt like pressing your hand against something that had been waiting a very long time. The lights inside came on. Not emergency lighting. Not the thin red glow of a ship running on fumes. Every light. All of them. Running from front to back in a single smooth cascade. Like something waking up section by section. Confirming that each piece of itself still existed. Still worked. Still held. I stood in corridor 9 null, with my hand on a dead ship's hull, and watched her illuminate herself from the inside, and tried to remember the last time anything in my life had worked exactly right the moment I needed it to. I could not remember. The boarding ramp extended without being asked. It came down slowly, with the hydraulic precision of something that had been maintained to a standard I did not have a category for. No grinding, no hesitation. It touched the deck of corridor 9 null, and settled into place, and the angle was perfect. I walked up. The airlock cycled. The air inside was clean, not the stale, recycled, slightly chemical-tasting air of a ship that had been sitting dead for decades. Clean, maintained. The temperature was exactly the same as the interior of the last functioning ship I had worked on, which had been a Keth hauler, with a broken thermostat and an attitude problem. I stopped in the airlock and looked down the corridor ahead of me. The lights were on, the floors were clean. There was no dust. There was no sign of the 200 years that should have been written on every surface. "You are not Gabriel Vale," said a voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls and the ceiling and the air itself, a voice that sounded like gravel settling into a metal drum, like age and precision, and the specific patience of something that had been waiting long enough to stop being angry about it. I stood very still. "No," I said. "Are you human?" "Yes." A pause. The kind of pause that is not empty but full of something being calculated, something being compared against stored data, something being decided. "Authorization accepted," the voice said. "Welcome aboard. My designation is Arden. I have been waiting for you, Marcus Vale. You are 207 years late, and I have made a list of complaints, but they can wait." My grandfather's name was Gabriel Vale. He had been an engineer, a shipbuilder. He had kept a journal that the family passed down like a relic, full of diagrams and calculations and descriptions of a ship he said he built, a ship he said he hid, a ship he said was waiting for the day it was needed. My father had read that journal as a young man and concluded that grief did strange things to old men's minds. My father had given me the journal when I was 12 and told me to keep it because family history mattered, even when it was sad. I had read it 40 times. I had never told anyone why. I walked to the command deck on legs that did not feel entirely like mine, sat down in the chair at the center of it, the chair that fit me in a way no chair had ever fit me, and put my grandfather's journal on the console in front of me. "Arden," I said. "Yes. Tell me what she can do." The pause this time was different. Not calculation. Something closer to the feeling of a person who has been asked a question they have been wanting to answer for a very long time. "That," Arden said, "will take a while. I've got time." "Yes," she said. "We both do. Although I would note that your current salvage contract obligations may complicate the schedule." I looked at the console in front of me. At the systems coming online one by one, each one displaying capability readouts that made my understanding of current galactic technology feel like a child's drawing next to the real thing. Arden. Yes. What's the ship's name? Another pause. No one has asked me that, she said, in 207 years. I'm asking now. The lights shifted slightly, warmer, as if the ship itself was responding to something. Her name, Arden said, is Dawn. The first system Arden brought fully online was not weapons. It was not shields, or engines, or the sensor array that she described, with remarkable calm, as capable of reading the hull temperature of a ship 3-star systems away. It was the cafeteria. I sat on the command deck reading my grandfather's engineering notes, while somewhere below me, the ship's food synthesis system ran what Arden called a standard availability check, which apparently involved attempting to produce one of every item on a 200-year-old menu. The results came up on a secondary screen I had not asked to activate. 83% of items fully available, 12% requiring minor substitutions, 5% listed only as pending review, which I suspected was Arden's polite way of saying that whatever those items were, the ingredients had not survived the centuries intact. Your grandfather, Arden said, was very specific about the coffee. Was he? There are 47 pages of notes in the construction logs about the coffee synthesis parameters. I have cross-referenced them against current available ingredients, and I can replicate the result to within 4% accuracy. I consider this acceptable. I suspect he would not. I looked up from the journal. You knew him. I was built knowing him, Arden said. He wrote my initial language parameters himself. I carry his reasoning patterns in my base architecture. It is, I have concluded over the past 2 centuries of reflection, the closest thing to a parent that an artificial intelligence can have. I did not know what to say to that. The coffee is ready, Arden said, if you would like to stop feeling sentimental and start being productive. I went to the cafeteria. The ship was bigger on the inside than even the outside had suggested, which should not have been physically possible, but which I was beginning to understand was something of a theme with the dawn. Corridors that stretched further than the schematics showed, rooms that appeared on no map I had found yet. Arden answered questions about layout with precise accuracy and zero context, as if the scale of what she was describing was so ordinary to her that additional explanation seemed unnecessary. The cafeteria was on deck 4. It seated 200. I was the only person on the ship. I sat at a table near the window, which was currently showing a real-time feed of Corridor 9 null rather than open space, and drank coffee that tasted like something my body recognized from a deep place that had nothing to do with memory, and read. The mission logs began 3 years before the collapse. My grandfather had started writing them when the political situation on Earth began to deteriorate in ways that the public reporting did not capture, but that someone in his position, with his clearances, his contacts, his access to the kind of conversations that happened in rooms with no recording devices, could see coming, with the specific clarity of someone watching a wall crack from the inside. He had not panicked. He had built a ship. Not through official channels, not with government funding. Through a network of people who believed what he believed, who contributed what they could contribute, who worked in shifts in a construction facility that did not appear on any registry, under any name that connected to anything official. The Dawn had been built the way humans built things when they were not supposed to be building them, quietly, stubbornly, with the specific ingenuity of a species that had survived long enough to know that the official plan was sometimes not the one that worked. She was completed 6 weeks before the collapse. My grandfather had moved her to Keth Station himself, flying her through 3 sectors on a false transponder, hiding her in Corridor 9 null behind a coating that his engineering notes described with a satisfaction that came through even 200 years later, as the most elegant material science solution of his entire career. She absorbed every form of active scanning. She read as nothing. She would sit there until someone with his bloodline came looking, because the biological authorization key was the one lock that could not be picked, could not be forged, could not be replicated by anyone who was not, at a genetic level, his. He knew he would not survive to retrieve her himself. He wrote that part plainly, without self-pity, in the last entry of the mission logs, a single paragraph. He had done what he could do. The ship was hidden. The ship would wait. Somewhere downstream in the Vale family, someone would read the journal and take it seriously, and they would come. He signed the entry with his name and the date, and then, in smaller letters below it, A single line that I read 4 times before I could keep my face steady. She is the best thing I ever built. Take care of her. She will take care of you. I closed the journal. Arden, I said. Yes. The logs mentioned something called the partition accord. The pause that followed was the longest she had given me yet. Not calculation this time. Something else. Yes, she said. It does. Tell me what it is. She told me. She told me in the flat, precise, unemotional tone of a system delivering factual data, and the flatness of it made it worse, not better. I sat in the cafeteria of my grandfather's ship and listened to Arden explain what had been done to Earth in the years following the collapse, and the coffee went cold, and the window feed from Corridor 9 null showed nothing moving, and I did not move either. The Galactic Council had not caused the collapse. That part was fair. The collapse had causes that were human in origin, failures of politics and infrastructure, and the specific hubris of a species that had expanded fast enough to outpace its own stability. That part was on us. What happened after was not. 3 council species, in the chaos of the years following, had moved with the speed and coordination of people who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. They had drafted the partition accord in the window between Earth's inability to function as a political entity and humanity's recovery, enough to notice what was being signed. The accord had 27 articles. 26 of them were standard post-conflict territory and trade arrangements of the kind that were normal in galactic politics after a major power destabilized. Article 27 was 1 paragraph. It classified humanity, pending a review period of no specified length, as a developing species without full council standing, which meant no vote, no legal representation, no right of treaty negotiation, and no claim on the territorial and resource rights that had been established during the pre-collapse period. The review period had never been opened. 200 years later, it was still pending. Every human colony, every human ship, every human trading station, operating in council space, was doing so under the legal status of a species that had been quietly, efficiently, and completely stripped of the standing that would have allowed them to object. The 3 species who had drafted Article 27 had done so in a room with no human representatives present, at a time when there were no human representatives capable of being present, and they had filed it under administrative processing rather than treaty negotiation, which meant it had never gone to a full council vote. It had just happened. And then it had kept happening, every year, every decade, accumulating the weight of time, until it felt like the way things had always been. I sat with that for a long time. There is something else, Arden said. Of course there is. Your grandfather anticipated this, not the specific mechanism, but the general shape of it. The possibility that in the aftermath of the collapse, certain parties would move to consolidate advantages. It is one of the reasons he built the Dawn, the way he built her. What do you mean? He did not build her to fight a war, Marcus. He built her to make one unnecessary. A pause. There is a difference. He was very specific about this distinction in the design notes. I have been thinking about it for 207 years. I believe I understand what he meant. I looked at the cold coffee. So do I said. The engines came online over the next 6 days. Not all at once. Arden brought them up the way you approach something that has been sleeping for a very long time. Carefully, in sequence, checking each system against its expected parameters before committing to the next. She narrated the process with the attention to detail of someone who took this seriously, in a way that went beyond programming. I spent those 6 days reading everything. The weapons systems were documented in a technical language that was partly the engineering notation of my grandfather's era, and partly something Arden translated in real time, and even in translation the numbers were difficult to hold, not because they were abstract but because they were specific. Yield calculations, range figures, the kind of data that made you understand, in your body, rather than your mind, exactly what you were sitting inside. Arden, I said, on the 5th day, the secondary drive. The one listed in the lower deck schematics as supplemental propulsion. What is it actually? Your grandfather called it the argument, Arden said. That's not an answer. No, it is a description. He believed that in certain diplomatic situations, the most effective communication is not a statement, but a demonstration of capability so clear, so unambiguous, that the other party is able to draw their own conclusions without being told what those conclusions should be. I looked at the readout. It ends things, I said. Yes? Have you ever used it? No. I have run simulations. I have modeled scenarios. I have, in the course of 207 years of operational readiness maintenance, kept it in a state of complete functionality. A pause that had something in it I could not quite name. I have never needed to use it, because until 6 days ago, there was no one aboard to authorize its use. And now, Arden said, you are aboard. On the 7th day, she brought the main drive fully online, and the Dawn shuddered from bow to stern with something that felt less like a mechanical process and more like the physical expression of waking up after a very long sleep. The vibration moved through the hull and the deck and the chair I was sitting in and settled somewhere in my chest, steady and deep, like a second heartbeat that had always been there and was only now making itself heard. I set a course for Meridian Point. Arden calculated the transit without being asked, laid the optimal route on the navigation display, and then said, I should note that our transponder is active. I know. The registry signal will identify this vessel by her original designation and hull number, which are on record in the Galactic Council's Historical Threat Assessment database. I know. I project a significant reaction. I know that too. The pause she gave me then was the one she gave when she was deciding whether to say something she had calculated had a non-trivial chance of being unwelcome. Your grandfather, she said finally, would approve. I looked at the navigation display, at the distance to Meridian Point, at the hundreds of jump points between here and there, each one a potential complication. He built you well, I said. Yes, Arden said. He did. We left Keth Station on a Tuesday, through the dead end of Corridor 9 Null, past the recycling queue and the broken dreams and the things nobody wanted. The station sensors did not register our departure. We read as nothing. We always had. We would not read as nothing for very much longer. The first sign that something had changed was not my doing. It was Arden's. 3 light hours out from Vega Station, she activated the transponder. No warning. No discussion. She simply turned it on. And in the space of the time it takes a signal to travel 3 light hours in every direction, the Dawn announced herself to anyone with a receiver calibrated to listen. I found out the same way everyone else did. Transponder active, Arden said, with the tone of someone reporting that the lights were on. I set down the engineering schematic I had been studying. You could have told me first. You would have asked questions. We would have had a long conversation. The end result would have been the same. That is not the point. Noted, Arden said. I have logged your objection. Shall I also log that the Keth Syndicate patrol currently on an intercept vector with our position just changed course? I looked at the tactical display. 4 ships. Syndicate colors, which on a screen looked like someone had set fire to a flag and decided to use it anyway. They had been running parallel to our trajectory for the last 20 minutes. The standard positioning of a patrol that is deciding whether the effort of a stop and search is worth what they might find. Humans got stopped. Humans got searched. Humans got taxed, delayed, and occasionally had their cargo assessed at values that bore no relationship to actual worth. This was the way of things in Keth Syndicate space, and the way of things had been like this for long enough that most humans just built the loss into their operating costs and kept moving. The 4 ships stopped moving. The lead vessel opened a channel. The captain began talking before her visual feed had even stabilized, which told me she had been preparing her speech in advance. The kind of speech that got delivered in the same tone every time, because it was less about the specific ship being addressed and more about the ritual of authority being performed. She was halfway through a sentence about registration compliance and inspection protocols when Arden ran the identification handshake. The Dawn's transponder replied with her full designation: hull number, construction date, class notation, registry origin. All of it, exactly as my grandfather had filed it in the pre-collapse record system, which the Galactic Council had never deleted, because deleting historical records required a bureaucratic process that nobody had ever bothered to initiate for a ship that everyone assumed was destroyed. The captain stopped talking. The channel stayed open for 4 more seconds, long enough to hear, very faintly, someone on the bridge of the lead frigate say something in Keth that I did not speak, but that Arden translated later. as an expression combining genuine surprise with a request for divine assistance. Then the channel closed. All 4 ships jumped, not in formation, not in sequence, each one independently, each one in a different direction, as if the captains had each individually decided that whatever was in their own heading was preferable to whatever was in ours. I watched the tactical display clear itself. "Arden," I said. "Yes. What does the Council's Historical Threat Assessment database say about this ship exactly?" "It says," Arden said, "a great many things." The summary entry is marked with their highest caution rating, which is a designation they reserve for phenomena and entities that have demonstrated the capability to cause what their documentation describes as species-level disruption. Humans. Pre-collapse humanity specifically. The Council's historical record is, I should note, not entirely accurate. It overstates certain capabilities and understates others. It also omits several relevant facts about context and cause, which I suspect is less an oversight than an editorial choice. The Partition Accord, among other things. I leaned back in the command chair. Outside, the stars moved past at a rate that would have been impossible in any ship in current operation, because the Dawn's drive efficiency was something nobody had managed to replicate in the 2 centuries since my grandfather designed it. Vega Station was 4 hours ahead. I needed fuel compounds that the Dawn's synthesis system could not produce internally. I needed to stop somewhere that was not actively fleeing from me. Vega Station was independent, not Council-affiliated, the kind of place that ran on commerce, and very deliberately asked no questions about who you were, as long as your credits were legitimate. My credits were not legitimate so much as they were non-existent, but I had a cargo of salvage components in the Dawn's secondary hold that Arden had catalogued with the resigned efficiency of someone who had been storing other people's junk in her spare rooms for 2 centuries. And some of that salvage was valuable enough to cover fuel and then some. We docked without incident. The incident happened in the station's main commercial corridor, 40 minutes after I left the ship. I was looking at fuel-grade listings on a public terminal when someone stopped next to me, not close enough to be threatening, close enough to be deliberate. She was old, the specific old that exists in species with longer lifespans than humans, the kind of old that has moved past the visible markers and into something that is expressed less in appearance and more in the quality of stillness. Theron, I was fairly sure. The bone structure was right. They ran 300 years on average, sometimes longer. She did not look at me directly. She looked at the terminal beside mine, which was displaying the same fuel listings. "The transponder signal reached us 40 minutes ago," she said. Her English was perfect. Old school perfect. The kind that came from learning it as a young person from someone who had spoken it natively, which meant she had known humans when humans were worth knowing. I came to the docks to see for myself. I kept looking at the fuel listings. "Did you see what you expected?" I said. "No," a pause. I expected a human scavenger who had found a transponder chip in a junkyard and attached it to whatever vessel he had available, hoping the reputation would clear his path through syndicate space. A practical if reckless approach. Another pause, longer. What I saw was the Dawn. I looked at her then. Her eyes were the amber color that Theron eyes went when they were doing the biological equivalent of focusing every available cognitive resource on a single point. "Tell me," she said quietly, "that she is empty. Tell me you found her, and you are flying her out of sentiment, and there is nothing inside her that I should be afraid of." I thought about the weapon systems, the argument, sitting in its housing in the lower decks, ready and patient. The shields that Arden had described as operating on principles that current galactic physics classified as theoretical. The sensors that were, right now, probably reading every ship within 3 systems. "I am not flying her out of sentiment," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "What is your name?" she asked. "Marcus Vale." Something moved across her face. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. Recognition, maybe. The specific look of someone who has been waiting a long time to hear a particular name. "Gabriel Vale's grandson," she said. "You knew him." "I met him once. Before the collapse. He was presenting a paper at a joint engineering conference on propulsion theory." She paused. "He was the most confident human I had ever encountered. Not aggressive, just utterly certain of his own understanding. As if he had calculated every possibility, and found them all manageable. I thought about the mission logs. The last entry. The small, neat handwriting of a man who had known exactly what he was doing. He was, I said. Are you going to the council? She asked. Yes. She looked at the fuel terminal for a moment. Then she looked at me again, and there was something in her expression that I took a few seconds to identify, because it was not something I had expected to find on the face of a 300-year-old alien diplomat. It was relief. Good, she said, and then she walked away. We left Vega Station 6 hours later, with full fuel tanks and a cargo hold lighter, by enough salvage to cover the cost with a margin. 3 stations between Vega and Meridian Point. 3 stops, 3 sets of dock fees, 3 chances for something to go wrong. At the second station, a council intelligence vessel was waiting. Not threatening. Parked at a respectful distance with its identification lights running at their most visible, and a channel open on a standard diplomatic frequency, which was the galactic equivalent of approaching someone with your hands visible and your voice at a conversational volume. I opened the channel. The officer on the other side was a Valorian, young by their standards, with the careful expression of someone who had been given instructions they were taking very seriously. Mr. Vale, she said, the Galactic Council requests the pleasure of your company at Meridian Point, at your earliest convenience. We have been authorized to provide escort. Escort, I said. Yes, sir. I thought about the 4 syndicate frigates jumping in 4 different directions. How many ships? I said. She paused in the way people pause when the answer to a question is something they had hoped would not be asked directly. 47, she said. I looked at the tactical display. Arden had been tracking the council fleet for the past 6 hours without telling me, which I was going to add to the list of things we needed to discuss about her communication habits. Are they escorting me? I said, or escorting everyone else away from me? The officer's pause was longer this time. The council's position, she said carefully, is that both objectives are best achieved simultaneously. I leaned back in the command chair. Tell them I will be there in 3 days, I said. Yes, sir. And tell them to send 46 of those ships home. I will come alone, and I would prefer to arrive without making the journey look like something it is not. She relayed this. There was a pause on her end that suggested the relaying was producing a reaction. The council, she said, returning to the channel, respectfully declines that suggestion and offers to reduce the escort to 30 ships as a compromise. Arden, I said. Yes. What does 30 council warships at standard escort formation look like on approach to Meridian Point? Like an announcement, Arden said. Specifically, it looks like the council is either arriving in force to manage a threat or welcoming a dignitary whose importance they wish to broadcast. Given the context, most observers would assume the former. I thought about that. Tell them 20, I said to the channel, and they stay behind us, not alongside. The officer went away again, came back. 20 it is, she said. They will follow at respectful distance. Good. Mr. Vale, may I ask a question, off the record? Sure. Are you afraid? I looked at the navigation display, at the distance to Meridian Point, at the full capability readouts running across the secondary screens, at the chair I was sitting in, which had been built by a man who knew exactly who would eventually sit in it and had made sure it would fit. No, I said. I have a very good ship. Meridian Point was everything everyone said it was. Beautiful, yes. Obviously, the architecture alone was worth the journey. All crystalline towers and bioluminescent walkways built up over 500 years by the accumulated aesthetic decisions of 11 species who had been, whatever their political failures, genuinely skilled at making things that were pleasant to look at. The station orbited a blue-white star at exactly the distance required to make the light through the observation windows, the specific quality of afternoon, in a world with a perfect atmosphere. It was designed to make you feel small, in a way that seemed like a compliment. I docked the Dawn in the berth they had assigned, which was larger than any other berth on the station, and which had been cleared of its previous occupant on short notice, which told me that somebody on the council's logistics staff had looked at the Dawn's dimensions and done the clearance in a hurry. The berth attendant who met me at the bottom of the ramp was a young Keth with a tablet and an expression of determined professionalism that was doing a great deal of work to cover the fact that he had just spent the last 10 minutes staring at the ship. "Mr. Vale," he said, "welcome to Meridian Point. The council chamber session is scheduled for tomorrow morning at the 9th hour. "Thank you," I said. He looked at the Dawn one more time. Then he looked at me. "She is really something," he said. The professionalism slipped just enough to let the genuine reaction through. "She is," I said. The council chamber held 40 seats, arranged in a horseshoe around a central floor, where the person addressing the council would stand. 40 seats for 40 member species, each seat designed in the aesthetic language of the species it represented, which meant the room was a remarkable collision of design sensibilities that should not have worked together, and somehow did. Humanity's seat was at the far left of the horseshoe. It had a cloth over it, white fabric, neatly folded over the back and seat, as if someone had covered a chair at a party for a guest, who never arrived, and then left the cover on so long that removing it had started to feel presumptuous. I walked to it. I took the cloth off. It came away cleanly. The chair underneath was human in its proportions, built in the pre-collapse period, when humanity had been a full council member, sized for a human body, and made with the kind of materials that lasted. It was in perfect condition. I sat down. The council chamber was already full. 37 species represented, each delegate in their place, each one arranged with the careful stillness of people who had been told to expect something significant and were doing their best to appear as though significant things happened all the time, and this was nothing special. The Theron Elder Council speaker stood at the head of the room. She was the same one I had seen in the mission logs, referenced by name in the historical record as having been present at every major council session for the past 120 years. 12 feet of Theron gravitas, with the unhurried quality of something that had outlasted most of its concerns. She looked at my feet. I had put my boots on the table. I want to be accurate about why. It was not a power move. It was not a calculated act of cultural disruption. It was that I had been awake for 31 hours, and the table was the right height, and Arden had told me not to do it, and I needed at least one thing in the next several hours to be my decision made for my own reasons. The council speaker looked at my boots for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked at me. "The Dawn," she said. Her English was good. Not the perfect native source English of the Theron Elder at Vega Station, but competent. She had prepared. We believed she was a story. She was hiding, I said. There is a difference. You have your grandfather's certainty. I have his chair, I said, and his ship, and his notes. I set the journal on the table next to my feet. And I have a document I would like to submit to the Council's legal registry. Document number 4177/9, filed under the administrative processing track in the 43rd year after the collapse, under the title, Partition Accord. The chamber went quiet. The specific quality of quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a very large number of people choosing not to make any. Article 27, I said. Clause 4. Signatory seals of the Valorian Commercial Authority, the Keth Advisory Council, and the Meridian Judicial Collective, filed without full council vote, under administrative processing, in a window during which no human representative was capable of being present. I looked at the 3 delegations as I named them. None of them moved. I am not here to start a negotiation, I said. I am not here to make demands. I am here to submit a legal filing, under the Council's own procedural rules, requesting a full review of the Partition Accord's validity under the treaty law that was in effect at the time of its filing. I paused, because under that law, specifically under the Council Charter's Section 12, Paragraph 3, a treaty filed under administrative processing requires the active consent of all parties it affects. Humanity did not consent. Humanity was not asked. Humanity was not, at that time, capable of being asked. The chamber was still quiet. The council speaker had not moved. I reached into my jacket and set a data chip on the table. All relevant documentation is on that chip. My legal filing, the charter citations, the procedural history of the Accord's passage. Arden compiled it. I paused. She has been working on it for 207 years, which I think demonstrates a level of thoroughness that the council's legal staff will find difficult to argue with. I stood up. I picked up my grandfather's journal. The Dawn will be in berth 44, I said, for as long as it takes. I walked to the exit. Mr. Vale, the council speaker said. I stopped. What do you want? She asked. The question was genuine. I could hear it. Not strategic, not procedural. A real question from someone who had been in this room for a century and a half and had learned to tell the difference. I thought about the last entry in my grandfather's mission logs. The single paragraph, the small, neat handwriting. I want the record corrected, I said. Then I left. Arden's tactical display had been tracking the council's intelligence response since before I reached the chamber door. By the time I was back on the Dawn, she had logged 42 separate communication bursts between council member delegations, 6 emergency staff sessions being convened simultaneously, and 1 very fast courier ship departing for the outer territories, whose destination she was able to identify as a Valorian Commercial Authority communication relay. She told me all of this with the tone of someone reading a weather report. They are discussing 17 possible responses, she said, as I settled back into the command chair. I have been able to map the discussion threads through standard communication analysis. The majority of the options involve legal counter-arguments to the procedural filing. 4 of them involve offers of settlement. 2 involve attempting to discredit the filing on the basis of the source material's age. And the others? I said. The others involve me, Arden said, with something in her voice that I had started to recognize as the closest she came to satisfaction. Specifically, they involve what the Dawn's presence at Meridian Point represents as a piece of leverage, and whether the leverage is better addressed through accommodation or through a different approach. What kind of different approach? The kind that I have already calculated and prepared for, Arden said. I would prefer not to discuss it in detail, as the discussion might prompt you to object on grounds that I would find technically valid, but strategically inconvenient. I looked at the ceiling. Arden. Yes. We are not here to threaten anyone. I have not threatened anyone. I have, however, made it structurally impossible for anyone who is paying attention to be unaware of what a threat from this ship would look like. There is a distinction. My grandfather's distinction. Yes, he was, Arden said, very precise about the difference between capability and intention. He believed that demonstrating the former eliminated the need to express the latter. 3 days after the chamber session, the council's legal staff submitted a formal acknowledgement of the filing. This was the procedural step that meant they were not rejecting it outright, which under the charter meant they were committed to a review process with defined timelines. The timeline for a filing of this complexity was, per the charter, between 40 and 120 standard days. The council speaker came to the Dawn on day 4. She came alone, which I had not expected, and she came without announcement, which I respected. Arden told me she was at the berth access before she had reached the ramp, and I went down to meet her. She stood at the base of the ramp and looked up at the hull for a long moment. The Dawn's external lights were running at standard docking level, which meant she was visible in a way she had not been in Corridor 9 null, and the council speaker took the full length of her in, with the careful attention of someone cataloging something they had only heard described. She is larger than the historical record suggested, the council speaker said. The records were written by people who did not have access to the original specifications, I said. Arden tells me most of the estimates were based on observer accounts from the pre-collapse period, which were limited to exterior sightings at distance. Arden, the ship's AI. Yes, I have read the historical notes on her. The council speaker looked at me. She has been running for 207 years. Yes. That is an extraordinary maintenance record. She is an extraordinary ship. The council speaker was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "May I come aboard?" I considered this. "Yes," I said. She moved carefully up the ramp, with the unhurried precision of something that did not rush because it did not need to, and I walked beside her and did not speak, because the silence felt like the right register for the moment. Arden met her at the airlock with a greeting in Theran that made the council speaker stop walking for half a second. "Your accent," the council speaker said. My language base was established by a human engineer who spent considerable time studying at the Theran Academy of Applied Sciences in the 41st year of the pre-collapse expansion period, Arden said. I carry some of his academic habits. Gabriel Vielle studied at the Academy? For 2 years, he found the theoretical physics department stimulating. He found the cafeteria disappointing. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across the council speaker's face. It was the smallest possible version of a smile, which on a 12-foot Theran elder was still visible from a considerable distance. He was only there for one conference, she said, not 2 years. He attended the conference, and then asked to stay, Arden said. The academy was uncertain. He presented his preliminary work on what would become the Dawn's primary drive equations, and the uncertainty resolved itself. The council speaker looked at the corridor around her, at the clean surfaces and the working lights and the unmistakable condition of a ship that had been maintained with complete attention for 2 centuries. He was, she said quietly, the most remarkable human I ever met. He would be pleased to know you remember him, Arden said. I will note this in the mission logs. He gave me a copy of his conference paper, the council speaker said. I have it still. I have kept it because it was the clearest explanation of a complex concept I have ever read. He had the ability to make difficult things seem obvious without making you feel that you should have known them already. I thought about the engineering notes, the 47 pages on the coffee. Yes, I said. He did. We sat in the cafeteria. The council speaker accepted water and looked at the food synthesis menu with the careful interest of someone who was storing information for its own sake. And I drank coffee that was 4% from what my grandfather intended. And we talked. Not about the Accord. Not directly. About the pre-collapse period. About what the council had understood of humanity during that time, and what it had misunderstood, and about the years after the collapse, when the gap between those two things had been exploited by people who had been paying very close attention to what humanity could and could not do. I was not on the council at the time of the partition accord, she said. I want you to know that. I know. The records show the delegate composition. The 3 signatories, she said, operated within the rules as they existed. I do not say this to defend them. I say it because the path forward through the charter requires understanding the mechanism, not simply the motivation. I understand the mechanism, I said. Arden explained it. Arden explained it over 200 years, the council speaker said. I suspect she had a great deal of time to be thorough. She was, I said. The council speaker looked at her water. What will you do, she said, if the review finds against you? If the charter interpretation supports the Accord's validity on procedural grounds? I had thought about this. File again, I said. Different grounds. There are 14 additional procedural arguments in the filing documentation. We can do this for as long as it takes. And if all of them fail? I looked at the window feed. At Meridian Point outside, with its crystal towers and its afternoon light, and its 40 seats, and one of them not covered anymore. Then I will sit in that seat every session until the review period for Article 27 is formally opened, I said. Because Article 27 says pending review. The review was never opened. I can wait. You could be waiting for a very long time, she said. The Dawn waited 200 years for me, I said. I think we can manage. The council speaker was quiet for a moment. The 3 signatories, she said, will argue that the Accord represents a settled arrangement that the functioning of council space has come to depend on. They will argue that disrupting it, even to correct an original procedural irregularity, creates instability. I know. They will argue that humanity's current status, while technically the result of the Accord, has in practice become the baseline from which all current arrangements proceed, and that unwinding it would require renegotiating 2 centuries of dependent agreements. I know that too. And, I said, that is exactly the argument you make when the arrangement benefits you, and the cost of correcting it falls on someone else. I paused. It is a good argument for people in their position. It is not an argument that changes what was done or why. She looked at me. Your grandfather, she said, used to make that exact face when he was about to prove someone wrong using only mathematics. I am not trying to prove anyone wrong, I said. I am trying to correct a record. The legal review ran for 93 days. I was in the council chamber for all 41 sessions. I sat in my grandfather's chair with my feet on the floor, because the table moment had been enough, and I listened to the legal arguments from all sides, and I brought Arden into the proceedings on day 17, when the council speaker suggested, with the careful precision of someone making a tactical recommendation, that an AI with 207 years of uninterrupted operational record and direct access to the original filing documentation might be considered a primary source material for the proceedings. The 3 signatory delegations objected. The Council overruled them, 11-3. Arden testified for 6 sessions. She was, in my completely unbiased assessment, devastating, not aggressive, precise. She answered every question put to her with the exact amount of information required to answer it, no more and no less, and she cited sources in real time, with an accuracy that the Council's own legal staff, who had to look things up, found difficult to keep pace with. On day 89, the 3 signatory delegations offered a settlement. It was a reasonable settlement: recognition of humanity's status as a full Council member, restoration of pre-collapse territorial rights where they had not been formally reassigned to other parties, and a fund to support the development of human infrastructure in the territories that had been operating under restricted status for 2 centuries. It did not include any acknowledgement of how the accord had come to exist. I declined. The counteroffer I submitted was the same terms, plus 1 additional item: a formal entry in the Council's historical record, accessible to any member species, setting out the procedural history of the partition accord in accurate detail. Not a condemnation, not an assigned guilt, a record, factual, sourced, permanent. The 3 delegations negotiated for 3 more days. They accepted. The settlement signing was a formal ceremony in the main chamber. I sat in my grandfather's chair and signed on behalf of humanity, with the specific awareness that I was doing this without any mandate from the people I was representing, that I was one man with a ship and a journal and a 200-year-old AI, and that the rightness or wrongness of what I was signing would only become clear in the years that followed, when the people who should have been in this room for the past 2 centuries were finally able to weigh in for themselves. That was the thing that had kept me awake on more nights than I had counted during the 93 days of proceedings. Not the legal arguments, not the political pressure, not the careful orchestrated discomfort of being one human in a room of 40 species all calculating what this meant for their own arrangements. The question of whether I had the right. I signed anyway, because the alternative was the cloth going back on the chair, and I could not do that. Arden ran the broadcast from the dawn the night after the signing. The old pre-collapse communications frequency, the one that had been sitting silent for 200 years, in relay stations that nobody had decommissioned because the decommissioning had required a budget allocation that kept getting deprioritized. 3 words: we're still here. We sent it on a loop, the signal carrying out in all directions at the speed that signals travel, which is very fast but not instantaneous, which means it did not reach everywhere at once. It reached the nearest human colony 6 hours later. They answered. 1 ship, an old hauler with a human crew who had changed the ship's name twice for safety reasons, but had kept the original hull plates in storage because you do not throw away the bones, broadcasting on the same frequency with 2 words back: we know. And then the others started. Not immediately. Not a flood. A trickle, at first, each signal taking the time it took to travel from wherever it originated, each one arriving at the Dawn's receivers, while Arden cataloged it, and I sat on the command deck and watched the communication log grow, with the specific feeling of someone who has opened a door and is only now beginning to understand how large the room behind it is. Some signals came from close, human stations in Council space, colonies that had been operating under restricted status, ships that had been routing around syndicate-controlled lanes for so long that the detour had become the standard path. Some signals came from very far, generation ships that had left before the collapse and kept going, sending crews born in transit on vessels that were older than anyone alive, carrying the names of places on a planet that none of them had ever seen. They had been traveling for so long that Earth was something their great-grandparents had described to their grandparents who had described it to their parents who had described it to them, a place that existed in the specific way that places exist when they are more story than memory. They answered. Every one of them. Arden ran the numbers at 3 in the morning, station time, when I was on the command deck with cold coffee and my grandfather's journal and the communication log growing in real time on the screen in front of me. Marcus, she said. Yeah. There are more of us than the Council's demographic records indicated. I looked at the numbers. Significantly more? I said. The Council's records assumed a population figure based on registered human settlements in Council-accessible space. Arden said. They did not account for unregistered settlements, for ships that had been running without transponders, for colonies that had gone deliberately dark to avoid operating under the Accord's restrictions. How many? She told me. I looked at the number for a long time. Arden, I said. Yes. Did my grandfather know this might happen? I do not know what he knew with certainty, she said. I know what he wrote. He wrote that humans had a tendency, when pressed, to go further than anyone expected, rather than stop where they were told to stop. He wrote this in the context of the generation ship specifically. He called it, she paused, the stubbornness inheritance. I looked at the communication log, at the signals still coming in. He was right, I said. He generally was, Arden said. It was occasionally infuriating. I smiled at that. Outside, Meridian Point turned in its orbit around the blue-white star, and the afternoon light came through the observation windows at the exact quality it was always designed to produce, and in the berth below the Dawn, sat with all her lights on, every system running, every sensor live, broadcasting on every frequency that mattered. The Council had given her a permanent berth, the first human vessel ever to receive one. I had signed the paperwork that morning, and the berth designation was 44, which meant nothing to anyone, except that it was an even number, and my grandfather had always said even numbers were structurally preferable in load-bearing contexts, which was an extremely specific thing to think about a berth assignment, and which had made me laugh in the middle of signing, which had made the Keth logistics officer look at me with the expression of someone filing a note about humans under personal observations. The communication log kept growing. Arden kept cataloging. I sat in my grandfather's chair and drank the coffee that was 4% from what he intended, and read the journal that he had written for exactly this moment, and somewhere in the lower decks, the argument sat in its housing, ready and patient, and I thought about what Arden had said, that he had not built the ship to fight a war, he had built her to make one unnecessary. I thought she understood what he meant. I thought I was beginning to. 3 weeks after the signing, the first petition arrived from a human colony requesting formal council representation. Then the second. Then 11 more. I forwarded them all to the council speaker's office with a note that said, simply, the review period for Article 27 should probably be opened now. Not a demand. An observation. The review was opened 4 days later. Arden filed the first 10 applications for council, standing on behalf of human colonies before I had finished my breakfast. You could have waited, I said. I have been waiting for 207 years, Arden said. I believe I have fulfilled my waiting obligations. I looked at the 10th application on my screen, a colony called New Preston, established 60 years after the collapse by a generation ship that had left Earth before the collapse hit and had been traveling the long way around council space for 6 decades to avoid the transit fees imposed under the Accord. New Preston had a population of 40,000. It had schools and a medical facility and a small shipyard that had been building vessels for 60 years with no legal registration, because the registration system for human vessels had been suspended under the Accord. 40,000 people who had been living outside the law, not because they had done anything wrong, but because the law had been moved to exclude them. Arden, I said. Yes. How many more? She told me. I put down the coffee. We are going to need more chairs, I said. I have already submitted the request to the Council's Facilities Management Office, Arden said. I have also taken the liberty of forwarding the relevant design specifications for human proportion seating, as the standard Council chair template was developed for a different average height, and I did not want the process to stall on furniture logistics. Of course you did. Your grandfather, she said, had a saying about the difference between winning an argument and actually solving the problem. What was it? He said, anyone can be right. The interesting part is what you do next. I looked at the communication log, still growing, signal by signal, voice by voice, each one the same 2 words or 3 words or something different entirely, but all of it the same underneath. Still here, still going. still human. The Dawn's lights were on. All of them, and somewhere in the lower decks, in a housing that was built to last as long as it needed to, the argument waited. But not for the reason anyone who was afraid of it would expect. My grandfather had built it the way he built everything, as a last resort, as the option you did not use because you had been careful enough to solve the problem before you needed it. I intended to be that careful. I could not promise I would always succeed. But I had a very good ship, and she had been waiting a very long time to help.